welcome to a chat that we're going to have just about S planning. We are a group of maths education enthusiasts that have come together via our professional development on Twitter and shared our thinking around how we can support teachers, whether they're student teachers, whether they're early career teachers, or any teacher that's interested in developing their thinking around planning and the process and the concept of planning and how it can best result in best outcomes for pupils. So we're going to just in the next 20 to 30 minutes, we're going to have a look at different interpretations and different ways of thinking around S planning. And S planning is something that has been developed over time through the mastery approach that many schools have taken on to help to unpick that process that we need to go through within our maths teaching. So there's two ways that we're going to look at S planning, which I'll talk about in a moment, but I thought we'd just introduce ourselves and so you know who we are, and then you'll be able to get in touch with us if you've got anything to add to the conversation. So my name's Keith Ellis. I am a maths primary PGCE lecturer at the University of Leicester. Hand over to Tom.
Hi, my name's Tom Oakley. I'm a local authority advisor in Cambridgeshire, and you can usually find me on Twitter at ThatMathsman.
And Matt.
Hi, I'm Matt Ellis. I'm a Year 4 teacher and maths lead at a school in Leicester, in Knighton, and you can find me on Twitter as well at Mr. MJ Ellis.
And Sara.
Hi, I'm Sara Tilley. I'm a primary maths consultant. I'm based in London, complete maths addict, and yeah, I'm all over social media too. But yeah, really delighted to be here.
And Alison.
I'm Alison Godfrey. I work with Keith at the University of Leicester, and maths again is my particular specialism.
Great. So what we're going to do is we're going to share some thinking around two different approaches to S planning. So first of all, Tom is going to share the thoughts around S planning to look at sequencing of teaching and how we best sequence a series of lessons and those small steps that are so important for children's development. And that's using some ideas as well from Vivien Townsend, who works with the Leicester and Leicestershire Skit. She's also on Twitter, who's not able to be at this recording, but we're going to share some of her thoughts that she has shared with her Skit students as well. And then Matt is going to talk about the work that he's done at his school, working with his Year 4 team and also across the school as well, to look at that consistency of approach that S planning can help with for that lesson design work, and making sure that you're working consistently across a large team to have a clear lesson design for all children. So I'm just going to share first of all our first screen and hand over to Tom.
Okay, so coming up on the screen now is a slide, as Keith said, that's been produced by Vivien Townsend and has been used in initial teacher training. This is at first glance a really busy diagram. It shows the progression of understanding from the starting point at the beginning of a unit of work, which in this diagram is in the bottom left, to the end goal, what we're aiming to achieve, however many days, weeks later the topic is. The idea of the S plan, as Keith mentioned, is that it is a way of organising our thoughts visually to show how an idea or ideas develop over time. In this version that Viv's created, you can see that we have an identified starting point, which is always important. We know where the children are starting from. We introduce a series of several small steps that are either designed to address something that's already that the children already find difficult or something they might find difficult. And then surrounding those small steps and building up over the period of time is a series of increasingly difficult or complex tasks that build on each other. You'll see that in Viv's diagram, the plan's been broken into different stages as marked by red lines. So we might have several ideas that build on one another over time, and that's what I'm going to talk about. I find this diagram at first can be quite overwhelming to look at. So what I want to do with the next slides I want to share is show you how a diagram like this can be built up bit by bit over time, so that we as teachers can think about how ideas join together over the course of a unit of work. Now, in this example, we're thinking about one unit that's got one specific end goal in mind, and that the ideas are linked together. So it might be, let's call them idea A addresses a tricky point and it's got a small step, then idea B, idea C, idea D, and they all build on one another. But an S-plan can also be used for planning one big idea over a period of time as well, or an idea that repeats several times throughout the year. So Keith, if we bring the screen off for a moment, I thought it might be worthwhile talking about the times when we might consider, or different year groups where we might see one idea that's repeated several times throughout a year. So two examples that come to mind to me are the idea of unitizing in year 1, so having units of 1, of 10, of counting in 2s and 5s, and that repeats several times throughout the year, and not just in year 1 as well, but it carries on throughout. And then also the other idea I was thinking about was how children might go about learning a times table or a series of connected multiplication bonds. Again, we've got one end goal in mind made up of several parts, but we might repeat that sequence several times over within a year as we learn our 2s. And then as we connect that to our 4s, and as we connect that to our 8s. And I just kind of wanted to open the floor to see if anybody else could think of an occasion where one idea is repeated several times throughout a year or throughout a journey that children might take in school.
I think the one that came first to my mind was when we are grouping and regrouping numbers, when we are exchanging and so on, and children repeatedly coming back to that idea as they're working with calculation over well, a very lengthy period of time, actually.
Yeah, absolutely, Alice. That idea of composition, isn't it? Composition and decomposition, and it applies to shape as well.
Mm.
Yeah, I was thinking something like telling the time would be an interesting one, because it's very much something you need to keep coming back to across year groups, let alone within a year group. And with digital, analog, 2 hours later, all of those kind of maths ideas, there's quite a lot that weaves into time, isn't there? So I think time would be a really interesting one to S-plan across a year. I'm
so glad you said that, Sarah, because that's what I'm going to talk about in a minute. Because it's the thing that I get most regularly asked to support teachers within their planning. Yes. I do lots of different things in my role as an advisor, but one of them is to support teachers, particularly teachers who are in their early career or new to a year group, to think about how do I sequence the teaching of time, particularly in a year group like year 2, where the children are expected to go from relatively little understanding to telling the time to the nearest 5 minutes. And in lots of schemes of work, there's dedicated a week to it or 2 weeks to it. So I'll dive into that. But yeah, I think that's an absolutely fascinating one. So yeah, fab. Any others that you thought of?
I think one of the things that I've experienced and worked with teachers alongside S-planning is looking at mixed age classes and those mixed, whether you've got 2 year groups in a class or 3 or even 4. And I think this is something that I found that teachers have really latched onto as something that adds that creativity. You're not confined to boxes. And so it gives you that opportunity to think whether it's something that's revisited over a year, but also maybe 2 years, because that also helps to structure that curriculum as well, to think about what needs to happen at the beginning of those 2 years or whereabouts of those children as they move through, rather than being in compartmentalized year groups. So I think it's not necessarily a concept in maths, but something that is quite tricky for some teachers to negotiate.
Yeah, absolutely, especially when you're juggling the demands that different children of different ages have, different prior experience. And we all know we can have that within one class, but that's amplified, isn't it, when we have several year groups learning together at the same time. So they might all be learning, as Alison says, about composition and decomposition of number, but they're doing it from different starting points. So they might be using different languages or different phrases, but the things that we can think about as teachers are the things that we can do to address any common issues, to provide structure and to help children to generalize and reason mathematically about it. I know, Matt, that you're going to talk more about it later, but I know I've seen recently some of the things you put on Twitter about fractions, and there are lots of themes, aren't there, that recur time and time again in fractions, such as proportionality, like how much of the whole amount, and how we use and build that understanding over time as well. So yeah, there are so many areas, aren't there, of maths where it's not straightforward. It's not just this idea and then this idea and then this idea. It might be we repeat an idea or we build on the same idea several times. So yeah, if anybody hasn't got anything else to kind of add, I'll move on to the tricky unit that I've chosen to share, which is telling the time, and then Matt can get more into the kind of the nitty-gritty of how do you plan individual lessons or sequences of lessons that have common threads between them. Okay, so apologies, I've used a different format for this PowerPoint slide. I've used a portrait version because normally when I'm doing this with teachers in non-COVID times, we'd be doing this on a big sheet of sugar paper and we'd be using lots of post-it notes as well and lots of different colours of pens. So when I generally tend to S-plan, different to what was shown on the diagram presented by Viv, I generally start in the top right and I work down to the bottom left. So you'll see that in the approach that I take. It doesn't really affect how we think about the journey. It's just a different way of organising the ideas. But generally speaking, what I want teachers to think about over the course of time is what are the big ideas, what are the core themes or things we want the children to think about? How can we break those things to think about down into smaller steps? What areas of difficulty might we need to think about in advance, bearing in mind children's prior experience? And then as we go into individual lesson design, how can we use models and representations, vocabulary and sentence stems, and then task design to address those things? So as we zoom into a topic, we think more and more about the specific questions we'll ask, the ideas we'll use, those kind of representations as well. So we start with a blank plan with a lightly drawn S in it that will eventually become more populated as we go. So on to the next slide, Keith, and we'll show that I've chosen a topic from year 2, all about telling the time. There's 3 main national curriculum objectives, and I've posted those at the top, and I've broken those down into ideas. And we can't, I don't know if you've got the facility on how you're showing it, Keith, but we can zoom in sometimes on PowerPoint to show the big ideas. And basically I've identified that there are 3 main ideas to think about as we go through this topic. And the first one is, what is a unit of time and what's the point of having a unit of time, like seconds, minutes, hours, days, months, and how can we help children to understand that those units of time measure a duration that has passed from the start of something? Okay, and then we build that idea into how do we represent and read time? How do we get children to think about how can we display the amount of time passed? Because of course, as adults, we use phrases like in a minute, ask me in 5 minutes, we'll do it in 10 minutes, and we don't actually mean a minute, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or even worse, we say, I'll do it in a second, totally blurring the lines of what we mean by a second or a minute or those kind of things as well. So the next big idea is about how we can use measuring devices like clock faces to show the passing of time. I always find it fascinating that when we wake up in the morning, the clock is already showing loads of hours have passed. But since when? You know, if you're a child and you wake up and your alarm clock shows 7:30, well, it's not been 7 hours and 30 minutes of conscious time. That's happened while you've been sleeping. So there's a lot to dig into that area there before we start reading what does the clock actually show. And then eventually, the third idea we want to get onto is how we can use those time devices, digital clocks, analog clocks, to show how much time has passed, to calculate passing of time, to compare the passing of time, and move on. So generally, this is how I begin. What are the big ideas? What are the core themes? And how can we map those out? And for those of you who can see me in the window, I don't guess what these are. I rely on knowledgeable experts to help me. So I've got my copy of my Derek Haylock, Mathematics Explained for Primary Teachers, and my Primary Mathematics Understanding, and a fantastic book by Ed Southall, Yes But Why, and more on the NTETM website to help me make sure I know the subject inside out, the topic we're about to teach, and how ideas build over time. The next thing we go into, so the next slide, the way I think about this might be different for other people, and I'd be interested to hear what you think, Sarah and Matt, is I generally think about what are the things that would stop the children getting in the way of understanding that big idea? What's preventing them from potentially understanding this? So I'm thinking about the area of difficulties. So it's really hard for children to comprehend the duration of a unit of time, especially a unit of time that's quite long, for example, a month or a year or a decade. I love that we teach children younger than the age of 10 what a decade is. Getting them to envisage something that's longer than they've been alive for. So it's a really difficult idea to come around, and we have to think about how we're going to address that. And also the difficult thing in this unit as well is we're not using our standard base 10, hundreds, thousands in the same way we are with other units of measure. We're using a Babylonian system that involves 12s and 24s and 60s. And again, that's another area of difficulty the children have to get their head around. And again, as we go through, lots of areas of difficulties, like what the clock shows and what we say out loud aren't exactly the same thing. Case in point, if the clock shows 1:45, we might say 1:45, but we might also say 1:45. And there's a lot of understanding that goes into why would we say that when the clock shows this thing. So again, I've mapped out the areas of difficulty. And on the next slide, with a team, we then discuss how might we break down the steps of understanding to overcome those points and to develop our ideas. And again, we can share these, and you can zoom in on this later if you want to talk about what they are. But generally speaking, we talk about smaller units of time becoming larger units of time, converting units of time. And the way I teach time is I teach children to understand the analog clock and the digital clock side by side, because there are very few children you'll come across that have got more experience of an analog clock than a digital clock. So we start by exploring what happens when I manipulate this digital clock, and I focus on minutes to start, and we see what happens to the minute hand on the clock face as we tick over those minutes. And then as we've been through our full hour, we see the hour hand changes as well. So our next small steps go into how many minutes passed, then the changing of hours and developing that language over time. So you can see we've built from core ideas to then going into areas of difficulty, and then the sequencing of small steps to build that understanding of time. If we were to take the next step further, so on the next slide, Keith, you can see I take one of those big ideas. In this case, there are 3 within the topic. And this big idea is understanding how many seconds there are in a minute, those kind of things, understanding units of time. I then break that down into the number of lessons. And by lessons, I don't necessarily mean 50-minute or hour-long slots within the day. It might be thing, and think about what's the small step, what models and representations can we use to explain that small step, what vocabulary and STEM sentences, and what tasks we use. And it's at that point where the role of the S-Plan for me as a medium-term planning tool stops, and we then merge into the territory of the shorter-term planning and the individual lesson design. And if we just slide one more forward, keep on to the next one, you can see that when we get into that individual nitty-gritty and lesson design, we start thinking about those models and representations. And I'm using the interactive teaching program there called Tell the Time. If you're ever teaching this topic, I highly recommend this resource. Still not beaten 20 years later, but alongside it, I've got STEM sentence and those kind of things. At that point, we're almost into individual lesson design. So I think we'll stop sharing there. And I want to kind of open to discussion to see what you 3 think of this approach of starting big with the ideas and then going into areas of difficulty and small steps before gradually getting into individual lessons. So any thoughts?
I think it gives you a nice overarching idea of the concept. I think if you're working, if you really want to improve your subject knowledge, if you really want to think about how children learn and your role as an educator and what your role might be within that lesson, I think that kind of stepping back and looking at the bigger picture is really useful, and the highlighting the misconceptions, the hard bits. Yeah. That's such a powerful conversation to have with teachers or yourself or your team or teachers you're training with.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it just makes sense. And it's nice to see those ITPs are still being used. I'm still using them.
I think you're right. I think it's so powerful. Even if you're a teacher on your own and you don't have a year group partner, just to have that conversation with yourself. How does this idea or several ideas join together? How do they develop? What are the tricky parts? And the tricky parts actually can be difficult to think of if you've not taught this topic before. So having reference materials like the books I mentioned to go to and say, children find this hard. so try and explain it in this way, or the NTTM website, I think is really powerful. And you're right, I think it's really important that we do think big, because as classroom teachers, we can get trapped into thinking lesson by lesson, can't we? Because there might be 5 or 6 lessons and an assembly and a break time duty and a club all in the same day. So we can sometimes get just trapped into that idea of forgetting where the lesson fits into the sequence.
I think as well.
Yes, I suppose. Sorry, I was just going to jump on that just to finish what I was saying. I think that whole looking at it, when teachers reflect before the next day of teaching, I think that helps you. And if you go back, if you teach something on fractions in the autumn term and then you come back in the spring term, that S plan is going to come back out, isn't it? And you're going to be able to really look at whether they overcame those hurdles.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's what I wanted to say.
And I think just to add to that, it's that to still use it as a working document, as you do with all planning. And actually, there's a lot more freedom and flexibility there, because you can add in those notes. You can add in those areas of difficulty that you perhaps don't think about to start with. I mean, certainly things like time, you don't necessarily know what those areas are going to be, and it just comes from a discussion. And so you maybe sometimes need to add those in. Or sometimes as well, having that assessment before that planning. Yeah. So talk to some children about what do they understand by time, or talk to them about some of the questions or some of the things that you might want to know, and come from a more informed place, because that will help you to also judge how much time you need to devote to things. But I think definitely that S plan really does help with that flexibility rather than thinking necessarily in blocks.
Yeah, you've just touched on my top tip there, Keith. That whenever anybody asks me for advice about planning, my top tip is find out what your children already know. Really establish what their starting points are. Do they fully understand what was taught previously? And have they thought about it since? Especially if we're taking a mastery approach and we're doing a block for such a long period of time, we might not come to it again for 2 terms, 3 terms, 4 terms, in some cases, even more. So have the children thought about it, or have they forgotten that experience and need reminding of it? So yeah, it's crucial we establish what their starting points are to figure out where we begin. And I love that that's on Viv's diagram. At the bottom, it doesn't just say small step 1, it says starting point, and it assumes that we know where the children are at. So yeah, it's really crucial that we gather that.
I think it's working in a junior school as well. I feel like obviously with the time, for example, as you talked about year 2 there, we don't cover the year 2 curriculum. So it's really important that actually, where have they come from? What do they know? It is really important you plan back to that point, rather than thinking you just got the year 3 objectives, we can only teach year 3. It's about going back, isn't it, to be able to go forward. So I think that's a really good point, to actually look at the big picture. Where do we start?
Yeah, completely agree, Matt. And assuming as well, I know this sounds cynical of me, but I can never assume that the scheme of work that I'm following knows my class. Yeah, they don't know my class. They don't know the starting point. They might say this is small step 1 and small step 2 and small step 3, but they can't ever indicate how long this small step should take. I'm going to have to make that decision for myself, and I might not know it from the outset, or I might have an idea. But as I get into it in my class, I think, oh, they're picking this up much quicker than I thought they would. We might get through this and this much more quickly, or they're really struggling with this idea. And I think the thing to bear in mind throughout is it's not a case of let's master this small step and move on. We sequence these ideas because the early small steps we need to keep thinking about over time. I'm going to introduce this idea to you now, and we'll keep building on that understanding. I don't expect you to master small step 1 completely and move on, because we could be spending forever on each small step. We have to assume that the cumulative effect of lesson after lesson, don't we? And thinking that through. So yeah, I think we're at that point now where you think, okay, we know where we're going, we know where the topic is, but what do the lessons look like? So I'm going to hand over.
So Matt, do you want to share your approach and your thinking around this? And I think it does really flow in terms of looking at that. As you say, Tom, it's thinking about that how do we space that learning out? How do we make sure that we're going back and building on that prior knowledge and knowledge that we're developing? And I know that's something that Matt at his school have really developed and thought about what that looks like for individual lessons to get that consistency. So I'll hand over to you, Matt.
That's okay, I'll just share now. Can you see that okay? Yeah, cool. So this is our interpretation of the plan that Tom mentioned. So when we went on the mastery course, it was given to us as the model that Tom has just discussed with you. But what we felt like is that actually it was a really good opportunity to have really great discussions about learning and about the misconceptions that we might find in our class. And as Keith mentioned, I think earlier, that he's obviously experienced previously about the year 3-4 mix of teaching, whereas the school I'm at, we have 4 classes per year group. So we're a large team where there can be lots of little misconceptions within the whole cohort of children. So actually this model has really helped us to think about what misconceptions there are across the year group rather than just in my certain class. So as an overview, this is what a 1 lesson plan might look like. This was a perimeter one from a year 4 lesson. Now, as you can see, this is a bit like Tom mentioned about getting the pens out and, you know, really collaborative thinking. Hopefully you can see that through the snipped images as we go through. A lot of this, the structure of it, is actually, as Tom mentioned as well, been produced from research. So we normally have a key of 5 steps in there. So we have the recap, we have a pit stop, which is with oral rehearsal. We use the I do, we do, and you do model. And then we have an exit ticket. And a lot of that's been taken from the Teach Like a Champion book, which has also been supported by the great walkthroughs book. That, obviously, they're quite hot at the moment, aren't they? So that is the structure. That's what we try to keep to within 1 lesson. So the first thing, as mentioned there, we look for obviously the learning objective, and we use the white rose quite a lot. It breaks the starting point and the end point down for each unit really well into different sessions that we might cover in that topic. We obviously make sure we're referencing the national curriculum next to it there. So as you can see, this one would be just to calculate perimeter on a grid. The lesson expectation, what we did was we thought about that we needed to pitch our expectation up. The SATs has definitely been pitched up over the last few years, and we felt like we needed to pitch our expectation up of the children as well. So using some of the research from the walkthroughs book, we decided that actually looking at the question types that we wanted to cover first, what we expected the children to do by the end of the lesson, gave us a better understanding of how we're going to get there, if that makes sense. Does that make sense? Yeah. So it's just about how we look at the question types, we look at what misconceptions there might be within those questions, and then we teach using those as ideas in our head already. Where are the children going to fall down? We use the diagnostic questions, which are fantastic, and we use a lot of white rose questions because they also provide really great questions already. We then look at a learning hook, for example, or a recap in learning. So on this one here, as you can see, we've got the recap of learning just here where it's an oral rehearsal. The children have got to obviously talk that through and put in the missing words. We also have an image, and the children have to discuss what maths they can see inside that image. So it's really just hooking them into that learning, the bigger picture of that learning effectively. Again, there's lots of great, that one was taken from the Numicon website, well, the Oxford OWL website, and it's a great image for area, for perimeter, you know, fractions. You can use lots of different things within that picture. We then go to our I do, we do, or as Tom has mentioned before, that we planted that seed in my head, the extended handover. I think it's a really good phrase for that. And again, within that, we do different types of models. So although it's an I do, and this is where we introduce our small step learning, we actually use different approaches within it. So we use different ways of teaching. So for example, the silent teacher approach. So the silent teacher is just where you're not talking, you're just modeling. The students are following you, what you do. Just so they're really concentrating on what you're doing rather than you talking and doing it at the same time. And we found that with certain areas, this works really well in terms of them concentrating and just really focusing on the key bits of learning, the misconceptions, you might say, later on. We then do a you do together. So this is our first opportunity to see if the children have understood what that small part of learning takes. So children have time to apply the new learning practically, and it's an opportunity for challenge for the early graspers and to keep them going, really. So we might put little challenges on the board, which will look a bit like this. So we have some children will have this already on the board, others might have to stop, and then we do the new learning step within it. And again, it's a lot of discussion based. There's a great value in letting the children sort of guide the lesson, isn't there? As Tom mentioned, or we all mentioned, that actually it's about finding out what the children know. So in each of these little pieces of teaching, they might already know this part. They might have been able to connect the learning already. And when they can connect the learning, we obviously can get through that session a bit quicker. But if they haven't, that's where we need to slow down at that point. And again, so then we go through another oral rehearsal. So it's really important that they are being able to verbalise. You can use that no opt out model where you ask them a question. If they don't know, you go to someone else who might know the answer. If they know the answer, then you go back to that child that didn't know, and they have to verbalise it to you. So that we're making sure that all the children are having that same diet. They can't opt out. We've got to keep going along the same path together. And as you can see, there's another one there, another example there of an extension, which is in the bottom of the screen. And it's just for those early graspers who can just go and have a go at a challenge whilst you work within that learning objective. So the next phase would be the concrete to pictorial, which can be the tricky part, can't it? It's I've been playing with my pneumaticon tiles, I've been playing with my cubes. Okay, now I need to move it into more of a pictorial way. So it's that skill of being able to model again. So it's the same type of modelling process that you've done before, but looking at how's this going to be looking in their book? What do I need them to know to be able to put into their book? And again, making sure that when we're modelling to the children, that if we want them to practice it themselves, you need to model something that's very similar to what they need to do. There's no point modelling something that's really easy and then give them something difficult, or the other way around. Don't model something too difficult, which if their work is going to be easier, you've got to be pitching it at the right so that you're making sure that all the children are succeeding in that lesson, or the majority, shall I say. And again, with the we there, you can see that the first two have been, that's what I would model to the children, and then the next two, they would have a go themselves. And as you can see, they are very, very similar in terms of the way they're presented. So it's just trying not to confuse the children with what you want them to do. And then finally, we have the independent phase. We like to, at school, do the apply it, explain it, and practice it questions. So obviously the practice ones would be first. And this develops the fluency side of things, but also can start developing reasoning, and then obviously going into the problem solving ones. We do have the greater challenge ones for children. So again, the diagnostic questions, but we also have the IC reasoning ones, which are fantastic. So they're very, very reasonably priced as well. So within that sequence there, you can see how we strip it right back, but we go to see what the questions are first, where our teaching might take place, and then we move on to the misconceptions. So what misconceptions might there be within that lesson objective? Okay, that's the sharing of it. Has anyone got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely fascinating to see, Matt, because it puts the real emphasis on high quality questioning, doesn't it? Yeah. Which questions are going to be the best questions to help the children to think about this part of their learning. And it takes a real skill to be able to identify that's going to be a really useful question this lesson, because it's going to drive the children's thinking towards this idea or this part of the concept. And those routines you refer to from Doug Lemov and Tom Sherrington are all about driving children's attention, aren't they, towards, I want you to think about what I'm thinking about. Are we all thinking about the same thing? So it's keep up, not catch up. We're all together. We're all thinking about the same thing. We're all developing our thinking about it. So it has to be reasoning rich, doesn't it, throughout, how children explain it to each other. So yeah, I think it's absolutely fascinating. And absolutely, it just shows that the value of thinking really carefully about the choice of questions that we use and how we put those into our lesson.
I think when we go on any maths courses, one of the biggest things that I always take away is, have you thought about the question types? Have you thought about what questions you want the children to do? Craig Barton talks about it a lot on his podcast. that really fine detail. And if you can really think clearly about those questions you're doing, not just snipping questions off white rows, but really thinking, are the children going to be able to understand that question? What is it that I've got to teach them to get to that point? Because yes, they are hard questions, but we're not trying to trick children up. If they don't understand it, they're not going to be able to answer it. So we need to make sure that we are really thinking clearly about the type of questions we are presenting to them.
I like the way you talked a lot about really kind of understanding what the children know, but that kind of that deeper level about really thinking about making it match. Because I see, I'm in a lot of classrooms and I see loads of fun, engaging activities, and all I hear in my head is Craig Barton, Craig Barton, Craig Barton. And I'm thinking, actually, how does what you just did be meaningful, or what the children were actually doing was meaningful? And I think the time that's spent really unpicking an activity and it matches your input, and it's just such a simple, basic technique of teaching, isn't it? It's nothing complicated, but I think over time, you know, even the more experience you can get, the further away sometimes you might move from that. And I think it's just really powerful. Right, I've modelled that. How does my, you know, my I do, you do, we do, whatever you say it, how does my bit fit in with their bit, rather than it being something different? And I think the cognitive overload of, yeah, I get that bit, and now we're doing something really exciting, but it's not the same model, it's not the same diagram, we're not using the same resource. I like the idea of having that conversation through the S planning.
Yeah, that the I, we, you model, the I do, we do, you do. We actually developed it from, we use it in English a lot.
Yes.
But obviously it extends teaching, isn't it? Effectively. And obviously, as Tom mentioned previously about extended handover, it really is that you are slowly giving them the power as such to get on with the independent tasks, aren't you? But you're just doing it by easing them into it, but you're still there as that support, rather than having to go around to all the different tables to say, oh, you haven't quite got it, you're slowly passing it on to them, which I think is a really clever phrase to use, actually, extended handover.
Yeah, I think for me that is definitely a key point, because that's always the tricky part, isn't it? That when you've done that teaching, you've done that modelling, the children then go off, they do their activity. There's always a mismatch there. There's always something that's forgotten, and we've really got to, as teachers, unpick what it is we do. It's not the children's fault, you know. It's about how we've presented that and that cognitive overload that they're experiencing. I think for me, I suppose this is a question for you, Matt, in terms of that S planning that we're looking at. This could be something that you have in a different format. You could, you know, you could quite easily put this as a list. You could think of it in many different ways, because it's about the concepts that are there. But what does that S plan bring to you in terms of, and your team as well, in terms of supporting your planning process?
It makes sure, obviously being a large team, that we're consistent, we're using the same type of language. It's agreed language, agreed oral rehearsal practice, the agreed question types. So we found it really useful in terms of, well, it's a continuous CPD for all of us, being able to talk to each other all the time, you know, getting different points of views, especially with the concrete part of the learning. It's very good that if we're all talking about it and modelling ideas together, that we're all on the same page, we're all modelling together. So it doesn't matter which teacher's in which class, effectively, we're all doing the same thing. So we found it really useful in that sense, that we're all on the same page when we're teaching. It does take time to obviously put together and think about those things, and researching, you know, the right types of questions, all that. It takes time, and it's really worth investing in it, because once you do get a handle on what type of questions you want, then you sort of, you know where you're going, and you fall into a pattern of, I know I need to go to these websites are really good, or this modelling type, as Tom mentioned about it, you know, following in a sequence, that actually the way that you might use fraction of amounts actually follows through in quite a lot of things, or mixed number and improper actually lends itself quite nicely into, you know, taking away fractions and all that type of thing. So that modelling phase, yes, it might take a while to actually think, but it can lend itself to so many objectives.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it hopefully brings that efficiency to it, doesn't it? So you're spending the time looking at the maths and looking at the concepts that you're trying to teach, rather than sometimes searching through for questions and searching through websites or other resources sometimes to find the thing that you really want, whereas this kind of brings that efficiency to it. And I wonder if it gives that time as well, and whether, Tom, you've got any ideas on this, and Sara as well, about whether it helps and brings that freedom so you can move things around. You know, when you've got this sequence that you're using, whether it's white rose, whether it's another sequence, it's having that confidence to be able to say, I'm going to do it in a slightly different way, I'm going to do it in a slightly different order, because this is the structure in which we've got our teaching. I don't know whether you've got any comments to make about that, Tom.
Yeah, I think there are certain examples of things that we've already talked about where it's an idea repeated several times. So a scheme of work might say, okay, we're year one, we're investigating numbers between 0 and 50, and we're going to represent the numbers. Okay, so we're going to show the numbers, we're going to decompose the numbers, then we're going to compare the numbers. So we're going to consider inequalities and equalities, and then we're going to order the numbers. Well, I know from experience of working with children that the idea of doing that with all numbers from 0 to 50 in one go and representing them all and then comparing them all and sequencing them all probably isn't going to go as well as I'd like it to. So why not break that down into a series of smaller steps that might be the numbers 0 to 20, and let's represent them and compare the difference between a number that's got 0 tens and a number that's got 1 10. And now let's extend that from 0 to 20 to 0 to 30. And we won't need to spend as long on representing those numbers smaller than 20, but we can now start comparing. And now let's extend it from 0 to 50. And over time, we might spend less and less time representing, but we might develop our understanding of comparison and decomposition and those things over time. So it's a really good example that actually the S plan makes you think about how much is there for the child to think about at this stage. Am I asking too much of them at this stage? Or is that small step really not small at all, it's massive, and I need to break it up? So yeah, I think that's a classic example really where an S plan can empower the teacher to make that kind of decision to get better results for the child.
I just wonder if there's anything to add from Matt or Sara.
I don't think I have anything additional to add. It's completely fascinating. I think even just I know this is so basic, but even just the shape of the S gives that flow and gives me that feeling that you could rotate it and move it and change it, opposed to a linear table, which we might want to fill in, and print off. But it's completely fascinating, and I'm really interested in the two slightly different approaches, sort of the bigger step back picture, fractions over the year, and then the spotlight that Matt talked about with his structures and his lessons. I think it just shows that the S plan is a really adaptable tool, and having the confidence like Tom's talking about, which comes with experience. It comes with conversation, doesn't it? Knowing your team, spending weeks on weeks planning with them. But getting to that stage where you do edit it and you do change it if it's not going to plan, and I just feel like the S plan, might be around for a few more weeks than just a weekly plan that might get put aside and then next week we're doing subtraction. It's just feelings I'm getting from what you've said.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point, and I think is maybe a good way to kind of summarise and to think about those two approaches and to think about people's next steps in terms of how they might adapt this and use this to be able to add that freedom to their own planning a little bit, but with that real heart of children's progress at the heart of that, and those small steps, and making sure we're doing the very, very best for our kids. So I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very much to Tom and Sara and Matt, and Alison had to leave partway through, but really, really rich discussion, and hopefully that's something that you'll be able to continue the discussion. So do find us on Twitter or drop us an email and continue that conversation. So thank you very much.